Ladies and gentlemen, it is an enormous pleasure to chair the third panel of today's conference, which is going to be devoted to political events of 2004 and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, conflict over Ukraine, and the questions which were widely debated around the world. How this conflict over Ukraine does contribute to state of affairs, international order, a state of affairs between Russia and the outside world, where we are going, how this conflict may shape our thinking about the future of international relations in Europe and more widely in transatlantic relations, transatlantic area. We have excellent panel members who kindly agreed to accept our invitation and share with you their thoughts on the events. So let me to welcome and introduce to you, starting from my left hand, Marek Menkiszak from Warsaw, very well-known and expert on Russian affairs in this country, representing Center for Eastern Studies, of course. Then we have Anton Kortunov, a Deputy Director of the Council for Foreign Relations in Moscow, a governmental institution supporting the process of conducting Russian foreign policy and, of course, contributing to the process of shaping this policy somehow. Then we have Sławomir Charap on my left, expert on Russian affairs in International Institute for Strategic Studies. Has written extensively about the conflict over Ukraine and how we should accommodate ourselves to new environment caused by it. On my right side, Ian Bond from the Center for European Reform, who would contribute not only expert think tanker knowledge about the state of the affairs but also his practical experience. Ian was a British diplomat for many years, serving in Baltic countries, serving in Vienna, in multilateral institution. So he's very, and even in Moscow, and Washington, so everywhere. So everywhere. And he will be able, I'm sure, to share with us his very unique experience and how from this very unique experience the question which is in the center of this panel may be tackled. Then we have excellent experts from Carnegie Europe, Ulrich Speck, who is focusing usually on European Union external relations and foreign policy. But in 2004, he was particularly interested in following German foreign policy, if I may, jump to such a conclusion. I'm following you permanently, so that's what my impression. And last but not least, on my far right, Anton Barbashin from the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding, this institution, who also wrote a lot about the consequences of a crisis over Ukraine for post-Soviet space and Russian foreign policy in this area. after this introduction of our prominent experts and panelists, let me move to the main question for this panel. And the main question is how the crisis of 2014 influenced the way how we read international relations as such. How it may contribute to the global order. And there are, of course, conflicting theories and conflicting positions about this question. Some say that, unfortunately, the post-Cold War order collapsed or failed, and we should somehow accommodate ourselves to the new circumstances. We should somehow accommodate ourselves to the fact that the rules were broken by Russia, and one group of experts say that the rules don't matter anymore. Others say that we should find a new set of rules in order to rebuild a kind of understanding and cooperation between states. Having said that, I would like to give the floor to Sam. He last year wrote a lot about this, well, new world order we are approaching to, and he offered his own suggestions how we should accommodate ourselves to the new circumstances. So, Sam, your role is to introduce to the main story of this panel. Yes.
Thank you very much, Sławek, and thank you all for coming, and thank you also to the Center for the invitation to this event and to speak today. I want to start with a perhaps semantic point. I don't like the word accommodation. It has a historical baggage attached to it, and I also don't think it's a particularly accurate description of what I'm about to talk about. But then I want to reflect on something that, in Sławek's question to all of us about what has changed in 2014. We can talk about the international order changes, but one thing that I think has, or at least has begun to change, is the luxury of not having to match rhetoric with rhetorical commitments, with resource commitments in particularly Eastern Europe has come to an end. And that perhaps we could have afforded this mismatch until this past year, but I think in that sense something has changed quite dramatically, and that we don't have the luxury of ambiguity anymore. But the crisis has gone way beyond the Eastern Partnership area, the common shared neighborhood, whatever you'd like to call it, and now poses even more, I would argue, vexing challenges. And in the West, there has been an effort, I think, to strike a balance between the imperative of responding to Russia's actions and the equally important need to avoid an all-out confrontation, I think, which everyone would like to avoid. President Obama said in July of this year that it's not a new Cold War. It's a very specific issue related to Russia's unwillingness to recognize that Ukraine can chart its own path. The problem with this balancing act is that it cannot last. And I think as the deterioration of the situation on the ground in recent weeks and months in Ukraine has demonstrated, there are forces beyond the control of decision makers in Western capitals that are pushing the circumstances towards the very new Cold War that they are trying to avoid. And so my case to you is that eventually we're going to face a choice, and that this ambiguity that we're still trying to maintain will not be able to sustain itself over even, I would say, the medium term. And the choice will be between that outcome, i.e. a new Cold War, which will prove hugely dangerous and costly, or some sort of negotiated settlement, which includes some aspect of a revised regional order for the so-called countries in between in Europe, which may be damaging for many politically, but I would argue is far better for those countries concerned and the rest of the world. You know, clearly the instinct to avoid the new Cold War is right. Gratuitously seeking confrontation with Russia, as we should all recall, could lead to Armageddon. But more to the point, there's still a perceived need in many Western capitals to have Russian cooperation on any number of other global priorities, particularly Iran nuclear negotiations, but also any number of other things, from Syria to Middle East peace to Afghanistan to counterterrorism and so on. And so as long as Russia is willing to play ball or to cooperate on those issues, the Western governments have felt that they have reason to continue to do so themselves. At the same time, it's also understandable why they have sought to avoid a negotiation on a revised regional order. The potential for success at such talks seems like a long shot. The status quo, while unpleasant and potentially threatening over the long term, is not affecting NATO directly. Treaty allies so far, while are rightly being reinforced, are safe. Western economies are affected, but only on the margins. So why bother with such a difficult, potentially momentous set of negotiations, which might involve challenging compromises? Fair question. So what we've ended up with is a sort of middle way between those two extremes. It's defined by maintaining cooperation on global issues while keeping up the pressure on Russia for its actions in Ukraine and supporting the new government in Kiev. It depends to a significant extent on avoiding a dramatic escalation of the situation on the ground in Donbass and on the Kiev government managing to stay solvent. It seems very prudent, and there's a lot of reasons why this path has been chosen. But my case is that it can't last, and that it's likely to devolve into the new Cold War scenario that, at the moment at least, Western policymakers are seeking to avoid. And that, I think, relates to a political and bureaucratic dynamic that exists both in Russia and in Western capitals. That will make it politically untenable over the long term to avoid escalation in Ukraine for both sides while maintaining cooperation on regional and global issues. You know, this political dynamic does exist on both sides, we should remember, but it is, I feel it particularly strongly in Moscow and in Washington, and I read about what happens in Moscow and also in Europe. So these political dynamics also play out in real time, and they are picked up by the other side in real time, and the hawks in each country, on each side tend to feed off one another and progressively raising tensions higher as time passes. But the second reason beyond the politics of this is that government bureaucracies are going to increasingly find it impossible to resist the urge to link the dispute in Ukraine to other aspects of interaction. Now, this linkage, of course, has already begun. It began very soon after the crisis began. Unrelated aspects of the relationship almost immediately were linked by Western governments to the annexation of Crimea. The EU canceled summits. NATO suspended most of the activities of the NATO-Russia Council. The US, basically all aspects of the bilateral relationship that were deemed non-essential, from most space cooperation to the bilateral presidential commission, were suspended. But what remains of the relationship today is therefore what matters the most to the West, from the Iran nuclear talks to the purchase of Russian rockets to launch US military satellites into space. And Moscow, interestingly, has for the most part continued to cooperate on these issues, compartmentalizing them from the Ukraine dispute. But this mutual compartmentalization, so to speak, has already started to fray. We've seen in December, for example, that Russia announced that it would not be attending the US-led nuclear security summit this year. We've seen announcements of potential new air defense system sales to Iran. And it seems like a matter of time until the tsunami of tensions overwhelms the remaining islands of cooperation between Russia and the West. And it seems to me that with you know, the new Minsk agreement notwithstanding, those tensions seem likely to rise. Because there has been no fundamental meeting of the minds when it concerns Ukraine. And even if the conflict in eastern Ukraine were to be frozen in some form, with no bloodshed but also no settlement, it will continue to be hard to maintain the middle way. And that has to do with the fact that the politics of this are not exclusively related to the Ukraine crisis. In the US, you know, being assertive vis-a-vis Russia will become only more prominent as our own election season approaches in about a year and a half. In about a year, the season begins, I should say, in earnest. And a similar dynamic, of course, plays out in Moscow, where nationalists, now including some who have returned from fighting in Ukraine, often criticize Putin for quote-unquote betraying Novorossiya and denounce his so-called Chekist oligarch regime. So you hear hardliners calling for Russia itself to renounce any number of arms control treaties and to end all cooperation with NATO member states. But even if those political forces can be kept at bay for a while, the key challenge for maintaining this middle way is time. It's explicitly framed as a temporary policy in place until Putin and his government give in to Western demands on Ukraine. And I'm not sure that, time is on our side in this respect. But even those who see the pressure that has been brought to bear on Russia as affecting change in its policies do not see it as a short-term proposition. It's a matter of many months, if not years, of squeezing Russia until you get a dramatic shift in its attitude towards Ukraine. And the problem here is that there's a mismatch between those dynamics taking a long time and the political dynamics I've talked about already starting to occur. So even in a best case scenario, it seems to me that it's just a matter of time before the new Cold War will overtake the middle way. And I would like to, you know, I use the language of the new Cold War in part because it resonates, but also I should note that it will be very different, this new Cold War, from the original one. But I think it's important to note that that doesn't make it trivial. What an outright confrontation with Russia globally would do is not inconsequential. And I think the first and most consequential outcome of that would be that Ukraine, as we know it today, would be finished. Even though its economy is in tatters, under this scenario, Putin's tanks might never occupy Kiev, but you know, the new Cold War would transform Ukraine into a violent, perennially destabilized economic basket case. Like as it was, someone gave me the metaphor of a Libya on the Dnieper. And it would also have a destabilizing effect on Europe, well beyond Ukraine. If we look back to the last uptick in tensions between Russia and the West, 2007, early 2009, Europe experienced a cyber war, a real war, and a gas war. And this time around, of course, there are allegations that Russia is financing fringe parties in the EU that threaten to undo the European integration project, abducting Estonian border guards or security service officers, allegedly, and pushing brinkmanship in the skies to dangerous new levels with seemingly weekly close encounters between Russian air patrols and Western jets, both civilian and military. This new Cold War would also entail outright Russian spoiling of multilateral efforts across the globe. Once the prospects of some sort of negotiated outcome fade completely in Moscow, I think the gloves will come off. And the West should be prepared for Russia to throw a wrench in any number of important processes. We saw what this looks like again in that same period of 2007, 2009. Among other things during that period, Russia concluded the contract to deliver the S-300 air defense system to Iran, which would have entailed near immediate Israeli strikes and the end to the P5+1 process. It offered a $2 billion quote-unquote bribe to the leadership of Kyrgyzstan to kick the US off the Manas airbase, which at that point was a key stop-off for American and NATO forces moving towards Afghanistan. So this time around, we should contemplate what would happen in the event of the end of the P5+1 process, Russian collusion with China on Asia-Pacific regional security issues, vetoes of all Western initiatives at the UN Security Council, blocking of the IMF's work in Ukraine. By the way, Russia's on the fund's board. And the list could go on and on. You could spell this out, and it doesn't look like a very pretty picture. And so we should keep in mind in that context, when we talk about the Western-led international order, everyone says the post-war order. Even though it was created in large part after World War II, it did not function in the way it was designed during the Cold War. And it really only began to function in earnest once the Cold War ended. And so I would say that the new Cold War would be likely to undo or reverse those 25 years of progress. And we should also keep in mind that, that this scenario would return us to old Cold War levels of nuclear danger. Admittedly, the sort of end of the world Armageddon one is not a likely outcome, but it is a very bad one, and it should focus our minds on the stakes involved here. The alternative to this, it seems to me, is, and one that would also put an end to Russian intervention in its neighborhood, would involve compromises. It would involve a negotiation where you have to engage in give and take. The West might have to end up recognizing that in its neighborhood, Russia might play more of a role than we would like it to, and that enlargement might not be in the cards in the next foreseeable future of Euro-Atlantic institutions. And this would be a tough pill for any Western leader to swallow, but I would argue that the alternative, that new Cold War scenario, is far worse for the West, Russia, and most of all, for Ukraine.
Okay, so some left us with this new Cold War scenario, and it would be good to hear Andrey Kortunov's reaction on that. Not necessarily only on this scenario, but how this 2014 conflict over Ukraine contribute to your understanding of international order, and to which direction we may together travel from that.
Thank you, Sławomir. First of all, in the spirit of full discretion, I have to say that I do not represent the Russian government, sure. And I represent just a small NGO, which might be related in certain ways to decision makers, but only in a very marginal way. So I express just my personal views, and I don't claim to represent anyone else. And let me start with a lyrical digression. Last time I visited Warsaw in January of 2014. We were a part, and Artem Malgin led our small group. We were a part of a delegation of the Russian Security Council, which came to Warsaw to discuss cooperation with the Polish counterparts. And we had a small workshop on the side, discussing the security issues in Europe. And our major topic was the topic of confidence-building measures, the issue of how to make military exercises more transparent, more predictable, and less of a concern to the other side. If someone had told me that in a year, in just 1 year, this whole agenda would be completely abandoned because of the gravity of new problems, I wouldn't have believed that. A year ago, we literally lived in a different world. We had a very different set of understanding of what is possible and impossible, what is realistic and not realistic, what is important and what is not important in European security issues. Sam has just mentioned the notion of the Second World War. I think that I agree with President Obama, who said that it is not a Cold War, but my conclusion is that the situation in certain ways is worse than it was during the Cold War. Because with all the bad things that we can say about the Cold War period, at least it was a period of certain stability. let us call it negative stability. But the situation was relatively stable because the rules of the game were clear and to some extent unambiguous. There were institutions, there were mechanisms of bilateral and multilateral dialogue, there were arms control agreements, and basically I would venture to say that the threat of an accidental conflict was lower during the Cold War than it is right now. So we're not heading to a new Cold War, but we're heading to a new situation which might be even more dangerous than the Cold War period. Now, one of the questions that we ask ourselves today is whether, this whole thing was avoidable. Were we really doomed to have this disastrous 2014, or it was a chain of unfortunate coincidences, a case of inadvertent escalation, a chain of events that nobody really wanted, but that nevertheless happened? I don't think that we will have an answer to this question. If you look at current discussions about the origins of the First World War, even today, I don't think that there is a consensus among historians about whether the First World War was inevitable, or it was just gross miscalculation, misunderstanding, a collective blunder. So my personal take that the crisis in this particular shape that it took over last year was not inevitable. I think that it was a case of inadvertent escalation. I think that there was serious miscalculation on both sides, and we can discuss it in detail. But I guess that a lot has been said about mistakes made in Brussels, mistakes made in Moscow, and mistakes made in Kyiv, by the way, during the period of 2013 and later on during the year of 2014 as well. But my take is that though this particular crisis could have been avoided, a more general systemic crisis in the relations between Russia and the West, and even more generally, in the international system at large, was practically unavoidable. And I will not talk here a lot about Ukraine, though I think that we can discuss this issue, because it is one of the central issues. But let me get to a slightly more general issue. I think that one of the strategic fundamental questions that we should ask ourselves is the question about whether the current crisis in Ukraine is an unfortunate episode in the history of international relations, whether it is an aberration, where it is an accident which will not affect the rest of the international system. The international system will absorb this destabilizing impact of a particular situation, or what we see is just the first manifestation of a much more serious problem of a global scale. And I think this is the question that we should discuss. My personal position on this question is the following. First of all, we had problems in the international system long before the Ukrainian crisis broke out. I think that one of the reasons for the problems that we had is that after the end of the Cold War, there was no commitment on either side, be it in the United States or here in Europe, or in Russia, or in East Asia, no commitment to invest heavily into upgrading the international system. And that's why we started accumulating instabilities. Right now, if you forget about Ukraine for a second, you should still recognize that the elements of instability emerge in plenty In the Middle East, for example, we see a de facto collapse of the state system. In East Asia, we see an accelerating arms race. In the European Union, we have some systemic problems. We have a problem of non-state actors in international relations which we cannot cope with. So we keep accumulating elements of instability. And that boils down to the question of old and new rules in the international system. Some would say, if you compare the global politics to a highway, we have traffic rules. And of course, there are people who do not abide by these rules, who break the rules. There are hooligans on the road, but it doesn't mean that we should scrap all the traffic rules and to start from scratch trying to invent something different. So those who violate the rules of the road, those who violate the traffic rules should be punished. They should be fined, and if they are consistent in their violations, their driving licenses should be taken away from them. But it doesn't mean that we should change the rule. My argument would be, this is basically the right approach, but it doesn't take into account that the vehicles which move along the road are changing. It's no longer a system when we had only trucks. We have bikes, we have motor scooters, we have pedestrians, and the road itself is getting very different from what it was 50 years ago. It doesn't mean that we should reject the rules of the game, but it means that we should upgrade them, and we should think very carefully about new institutions, new legal norms. We should think about a reform of the international public law. We should think about new regimes that would manage the problems that we didn't notice 50 years ago. And there are many, fundamental issues that we have to deal with. For example, we have to find a way to incorporate non-state actors in the system of international relations. And these non-state actors, which are sometimes very powerful, are not really represented in many institutions. We have to reconcile problems of security and problems of development. And these two sets of issues are often handled by different bureaucracies, by different institutions, and there is a gap between security and development. We have to think about the gap between short-term political goals of national leaders and long-term needs of the international system at large. And again, this is a question which is not directly related to the Ukrainian crisis, but will be with us no matter how the crisis is going to be resolved. So in my view, the year of 2014 might become a turning point if it has a sovereign impact on politicians, on opinion makers, on the academic communities all over the world. I don't think that we keep accumulating sources of instability anymore without running a risk of very serious consequences for all the humankind. And if I were to single out the most important issue, on top of my list, I would put the issue of global governance. I think that we are losing this game. We are losing this battle for global governance. For me, the turning point was the financial crisis of 2008-09, when there was a chance to raise the coordination of major economic, financial, resource issues to a different level. But this opportunity, unfortunately, was not properly used. So let me conclude with saying that I do believe, and hopefully, this event here in Warsaw will be one of the first symptoms of that, that we change the mode of our thinking, that we take into account the change in environment, and that we demonstrate an an understanding not just of short-term problems, with all the importance of these problems, but also long-term challenges that all of us face. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrey. So we have your point that the system or the environment to which we are heading may be even worse than the Cold War, because the Cold War provided a sense of stability, while we are in the situation where neither Russia nor Europe and no United States are able to provide a stable condition for resolving problem around the Ukraine. And your point is that we should think about new system, new laws, new rules of the game. And I will have the question after this round to you, what should be first? Should we re-establish our confidence to the old rules and old norms first, and then start to think about new system and new architecture, or otherwise? I mean, we should forget about the rules that have been already broken and start to think about new system. That's the question we will debate later. Now I would like to give the floor to a far left of mine, Marek Menkiszak, and then I will go to the right. The left is always most progressive, so let's give him the chance to speak first.
Thank you. Chinese batteries. Yes. No. Thank you. I've never been called far left, but I will take it. I agree with my predecessors in a way that we are not yet, at least, in the new Cold War situation. We are not yet, at least for three reasons. The first reason is that during the Cold War there were two sides which were guarding the status quo, and they were interested actively in guarding those status quo. Now we have a situation when one side, namely Russia, is trying to destroy the status quo, which feels is unjust and feels that was unjustly imposed on Russia in the early 90s when Russia was weak. And now, since the political leadership in Russia believes Russia is strong, relatively at least, it tries simply to destroy this unjust order and to draw a new order which would be much more beneficial for Russia. So that's a completely different situation. There is no Cold War also because there is a Russian-Ukrainian war which is perceived only in Moscow as a proxy war with the West. But it's not perceived yet in the West as a proxy war with Russia. That's a kind of unilateral war which is waged, and most of the people, elites in the West, does not believe, or they cannot really believe it, that there is something much more serious within this. And that, as President Putin and his colleagues suggested publicly on many occasions, this is the United States which is the cause of all of that. And US policies, being performing a hegemonic role in the West. So you cannot have a situation in which only one side believes is at war So this is a strange situation. The third reason was actually mentioned already, that there are still attempts on both sides, but it's naturally on the Russian side, but there is also certain attempts on the part of the European side of decoupling the Russian-Ukrainian war with the other aspects. So let's agree to disagree on Ukraine and carry on our fruitful cooperation in other spheres like Middle East, like non-proliferation, whatever you name it, Korean, all these important Islamic state, which was quite openly suggested in the so-called Mogherini paper. So this is not a Cold War situation. Next issue is whether we should agree on some new rules. And this is extremely strange approach. We are talking, some people talk about Helsinki 2, some new ideas, maybe about some kind of formal relationship between the European Union and the Eurasian Union, trying to seek some solutions in the futile belief that this conflict in Ukraine can be frozen because Russia really wants to freeze that, which is not the case. Russia is not interested in freezing this conflict. Russia is interested in making actually this scenario which was presented by Samuel Charap, which making Ukraine fail state. So the problem is that there is no room for compromise, in my perception, between the concept of spheres of influence, which is basically the Russian concept, that there is a natural sphere of influence for Russia which has to be accepted, and about the rest we can negotiate, meaning about the Western part we can negotiate, but not about the eastern part of it. So there is no feasible compromise possible between this concept and the concept of free choice of alliances, the concept of, well, some people call it Europe whole and free. These are inconceivable. I mean, they cannot be agreed between one another. There are Russian idea about the alternative normative space as Eurasian Union. There is a Russian idea and Russian concept, or rather Russian project, conservative project, which is actively pursued not only internally, domestically, but there are attempts to export it. They're active reaching out from Russia to the new populist radical groups within Europe. And this is a challenge. This is a challenge, not only a kind of a very limited challenge just for securing the so-called natural space covering Ukraine, other post-Soviet, temporarily minus Baltic. But it is much more, it goes much further. It reaches to the heart of Europe. It reaches to the undermining of whole institutional value and the normative basis of the European order. That's a challenge for the very order of Europe and in general towards the Western order. So this is a kind of a systemic challenge which is coming from Russia. Therefore, I do not believe that any attempt to compromise, even if those people who believe that it would be needed to sacrifice Ukraine because it will make Russia satisfied and finally we could draw some borders or at least to seek a common ground with Russia, that it will not happen because the challenge is much more far-reaching. So finally, the third point about the global impact. Of course, if such European order will be undermined by Russia, of course it will have a global impact. Decoupling US from Europe, possible destruction of NATO in real terms, weakening of the EU and its loss of its cohesion. All this will have obviously much broader impact. As Russian-Ukrainian war has already impacted, I would say, and possibly can impact the global order, tearing off Budapest Memorandum of security guarantees to Europe obviously undermines a global non-proliferation regime. Obviously, illegal occupation and annexation of Crimea could have potentially backlash, let's say, in Asia. China is watching very closely Western reactions to these events, and some people, some elites in East Asia are afraid of potential consequences of these for the Chinese policies and rethinking of Chinese policies towards its neighborhood. So there are vast potential of very grave consequences of current situation for the global order also. But it very much depends actually on how the West in general and how individual institutions and states of the West will react to the current challenge. Whether they will try to appease Russia, to try to seek some compromises, even if those compromises will be only interim, or whether they will be enough strong politically with political will to pursue a policy of deterrence and containment, which is, in my perception, the only feasible policy in that situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marek. So the left part of this panel ended with kind of disagreement as far as the future of the relations between the West and Russia and the future of conflict about Ukraine is concerned. I think that all three speakers agreed to some extent with the thesis that the situation which started in 2014 badly have a quite good chance to deteriorate further in months and years to come. Sam and Andrey are making the point that we should do everything which is only possible to avoid this kind of scenario, and we should try to find a kind of compromise between Russia and the West. And Marek says that, okay, the situation is going to be worse, but there is no much chance for finding a common ground, and the compromise is hardly feasible. So let's turn to the right part of the panel, starting from moderate right, of course, and let's hear their contributions. How do you see this prospect, gentlemen?
Well, thank you very much, Sławomir. I'm not sure whether I belong on the moderate right, but I'll do my best. One of the problems I now face is that I could probably say what I need to say in about 2 seconds, which is to say, I agree with Marek. And that might save you all some time. But at the risk of depriving you of some minutes of your lives that you won't get back, let me try and say in a bit more detail how I see things. I thought this morning's first session on opinion polls was quite interesting, although in some ways quite depressing, because it shows that over the last couple of years, perceptions of the other side, the other country in both Poland and Russia, seem to have got worse. And I think that's inevitable in view of what has been happening on the ground, but nonetheless it's not a positive sign. My worry is that the machinery that was built up during the Cold War has essentially broken down. And I was glad that Andrey mentioned the question of confidence-building measures, because one of the things that's been very striking for me, having earlier in my career been involved in the negotiation of some of these measures, is that Russia is making such extraordinary efforts to circumvent the systems that were put in place to create military predictability. From the Stockholm document in the mid-1980s onwards, systems were put in place so that NATO and first the Warsaw Pact, and then later on the NATO countries and the individual countries outside NATO were supposed to tell each other what they were planning to do, and if they were doing large exercises, they were supposed to invite observers to them. And what Russia has been doing over the last few years is to conduct very large exercises in ways that avoid the necessity of either notifying or inviting observers. So either breaking them down into allegedly independent elements, which are in fact all conceptually linked, or conducting them without notice to the troops, so that you can claim that since the troops themselves were not aware that they were going to be called out of barracks, then nobody else could have been told either. And the result of that is to create a great deal of unpredictability. Now, I suspect that the exercises that are going on in Kaliningrad at the moment probably would have been too small to attract notification or observation in the past anyway. But when I read that Russian forces in Kaliningrad were practicing the covert deployment of Grad launchers and other heavy artillery systems, I wondered what on earth we are, in fact, doing. There is something very peculiar going on in a Europe where one country finds it necessary to practice the covert deployment of extremely offensive systems in an area which is very close to the borders of its already highly nervous neighbors. So I do fear that machinery which was painstakingly built up over the period, I would say, from the fall of Khrushchev to the end of the Cold War and beyond, is now being dismantled. And this process is not entirely new. It started with the denunciation of the CFE treaty, with the attempt, in a sense, to destroy the logic of a treaty which had tried to move forces away from a line of contact in Central Europe, and to say that because Russia was a single country, if it wished to concentrate forces at any point on its border, then it should be able to do that. Now, as a practical matter, no doubt it can, but as a political matter, that is quite destabilizing. What happened in Ukraine last year didn't come out of a clear blue sky. In fact, I would argue that you could go back almost to the beginning of the 1990s and say that Russia has been able to conduct deniable warfare. And what for a long time the West did was either actively to support this, and I'll mention cases where I think that was true, or at any rate to turn a blind eye to it and to pretend that it was not happening. So, I mean, one can look at what happened in South Ossetia and Abkhazia in the early 1990s. The late Russian journalist Dmitry Kholodov, who was killed as a result of his attempts to expose corruption in the Russian Ministry of Defense, did some extraordinary work in revealing what was going on in Abkhazia in the early 1990s, when you had both regular but undeclared Russian forces active. You had the Russian Air Force conducting bombing raids on Georgian positions, and you had so-called volunteers, including Shamil Basayev, who was an operative of the Russian intelligence services long before he became Russia's most wanted terrorist. All of this was allowed to unroll, with the West essentially knowing what was going on, but feeling that the best thing we could do was to let the Russians get on with it. Indeed, in some respects, we actively encouraged them because the West itself was not interested in getting involved in conflicts in the former Soviet Union. And if the end point of a conflict was that it became frozen, then that was some sort of a stabilization measure. So we roll forward to 2008. And by this stage, we have governments particularly in Georgia, but to some extent also in Ukraine, which were pursuing NATO membership. Now, the Americans were quite the American government, I should say, perhaps, given that Sam is sitting here. The American government of the time was quite enthusiastic about this. There was not much enthusiasm in many other places, and certainly Germany and France blocked what the US was trying to do at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. But that didn't draw a line under this. Even though for all practical purposes, NATO has kept Georgia and Ukraine very much at arm's length since, making a rhetorical commitment that they would, at some unspecified point in the future, become members, but in fact doing everything possible to find additional conditions that they would have to meet. Nonetheless, that didn't seem to be adequate. And so we had a war in August of 2008. And this was quite extraordinary because you could see this coming from some distance off. You know, Russian troops were being moved into South Ossetia. There were various sorts of provocations. Now, I am not going to whitewash Mikhail Saakashvili because he was a man who was wound up and ready to go when there was a provocation to react to. But I can say, having worked in the OSCE, that from about 2003 onwards, we knew that additional military equipment was being moved into South Ossetia, contrary to the ceasefire agreement that had ended the conflict there. And we all sat on this information. We did nothing, and we created the conditions in which the conflict was able to start in 2008. Now, what about Ukraine? I mean, the thing that is really striking about Ukraine is that in 1975, the Soviet Union was able to sign up to the so-called Hamlet Clause in the Helsinki Final Act. And Russia reaffirmed this in the Charter of Paris and various other documents, that all European nations had the right to be or not to be parties to treaties of alliance. Now, I can just about conceive that a country like Ukraine joining NATO might be perceived as a military threat if you are looking for military threats. Given the fact that NATO has been slashing defense spending for most of the last 25 years, it's a pretty feeble threat. But nonetheless, I can see how that might be perceived as an issue. I cannot perceive why an association agreement with the EU elicits the same response. We're talking about free trade, improving the quality of Ukrainian foodstuffs, helping Ukraine to meet certain labor standards and the like. And yet, when conflict came, it did not come over the question of NATO membership. It came over the question of joining or not joining an association, or rather signing or not signing an association agreement, not even a membership agreement. And I think EU leaders still struggle to understand exactly what was going on there. Now, as I say, I don't see what happened last year as a fundamental change, because I think that the change has actually been gradual. But we did reach a point last year where it became impossible to ignore what was actually going on. And I want finally to underline what I see as three key negative conclusions that one has to draw from the events of last year. The first is that there has been a dangerous weakening of international law. Apart from any arguments that one may have about the Budapest Memorandum, which technically was not an internationally legally binding agreement, Russia had a legally binding treaty of 1997 with Ukraine by which it recognized the existing border and agreed to respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the country. That treaty was grossly violated with the annexation of Crimea, and it has continued to be grossly violated by the presence of Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. Once you start to unravel this fundamental international law in Europe, there is no knowing where it ends. There is almost no country on the continent of Europe which now lives within the borders that it has always had. Poland could claim that its borders should be much further to the east. Germany could claim back Königsberg. This is the route to absolute madness in Europe. So that is my first conclusion. The second conclusion is that we face a fundamental challenge to the idea that peoples have the right of determining their own foreign policy course. We have hardly heard from Sam, as far as I could tell, or from Andrey, what agency the Ukrainians have in their own future. In the end, we are talking about a sovereign country. If they determine that they want to join the Eurasian Economic Union, then the EU will not stand in their way. But if they have expressed a vision of ultimately joining the EU, then nor is it for Russia to stand in the way of that. And the final thing I would say is that the last year has seen a considerable weakening and division in the EU and NATO, which both organizations need to address in the coming year. There has been a very active effort, as some have said, to cultivate as Marek, I think, said, to cultivate right-wing populist parties, opposition movements, but also actually mainstream parties and governments. And you can see that in countries like Cyprus and Hungary and Italy. These institutions, like the EU and NATO, have created an enlarging space of peace and prosperity in Europe over the last 60 years. That area of peace and prosperity is, in the long term, also in Russia's interest. And we face a very dangerous situation in which, for short-term reasons of political survival, the current Russian leadership are messing with a system that actually keeps us all safe for the long term.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anne, for mentioning, I think, the most crucial thing which was lacking so far. I mean, that in result of the conflict of 2014, we are in the situation where is no confidence at all, and that Russia is not interested in building a confidence. You mentioned this confidence building measure as a part of a very important mechanism established after the Cold War, but during the Cold War and soon after. You mentioned the problem of international law, which the confidence also comes from the fact that we all respect our commitments to the international law. And yet another issue mentioned by you is quite interesting. You said that we may have known what is going on. I mean, what may have happened. But for political reasons, we, the West, decide to ignore the signals coming from Russia, and we simply didn't react, or we simply, turned blind eye on that. Eventually, one may say that we invited troubles, not reacting properly. Okay, Uli.
Thank you. Number 5. A lot has been said. I try to add a little bit. I start with 4 observations, and then I will propose an interpretation of what all this means. The 4 observations, Russia has been said by Marek a lot. Russia has broken with the post-Cold War order and is now a revisionist power. It challenges the order of 1991, basically. So this is, I think, signs were there, we saw it, but now it's obvious. The EU has reacted stronger than expected. It has not reacted like after the Russian-Georgian War in 2008, which may have been the expectation in Moscow. Instead, it has agreed on tough economic sanctions, and we have a growing realization of what is going on in the East, also in Western Europe. The US, I think the US has acted not so much as a European power, rather as a strong and close partner to Europe. Germany has taken a leadership position and has united Europe behind strong sanctions, something that has been unexpected. So we could even argue that for the first time the EU has been united in a very crucial international crisis moment. China is the wild card. China is sitting on the fence, is playing both sides a little bit. Doesn't come down on the Russian side, which is, I think, very important, because Moscow may have expected that China would team up with Russia in a joint anti-Western front. This hasn't happened. So what is this all about? In my view, it is about 2 kinds of order, two visions of order. One I call multipolar, the other I call multilateral order. What is the multipolar order? I think we see in Russia, in the Kremlin, a conception of order in a very Darwinist sense. It's the survival of the fittest. Those who are weak have to accept the rules that are set by the strong. There are basically two poles at the moment. In Putin's view, one is the US, the other is China. And my reading of what he's doing is he's trying to elevate Russia into a third pole. Those poles are completely sovereign. They are not bound by alliances. They don't respect treaties, international law. That's for the weak. They dominate the neighborhood and compete with each other in a permanent struggle, in a state of nature. For Putin, if he wants to build Russia into one of those poles, he had first to rebuild autocratic power in Russia itself, the power vertical. And the second step, I think we are just witnessing now. He wants to get control of the neighborhood in order to elevate Russia to not just a regional power, as Obama has said, but a power of global weight. So the Eurasian Union is a conditio sine qua non for his project, and he cannot just step back and say, well, okay, I accept that there are association agreements, I accept that they all join the DCFTA and have just a customs union with Russia. No, he wants more. He wants really, the Eurasian Union is an element, is an instrument of control. It's not an economic instrument, it's a political instrument. So the third element of his plan, if I'm not mistaken, is he needs to neutralize Europe. He needs to make sure that Europe is not becoming a pole in itself. Germany, France, Britain. So he needs to play his divide and rule game. He needs to undermine the EU, make it weak, make sure that the EU has no common foreign policy. And he needs to separate Europe from the US, the transatlantic alliance. If these are the goals, if this is Putin's project, so what happened in 2014, did the year advance his goals? I don't think so. Some points. Putin lost Germany. This is big. Germany has always been the most important country in Putin's view. Today, in March, 1 year ago, we had a big majority in Germany against sanctions, I think 70 or 80%. And now we have 60% in favor of hard economic sanctions. So Germany really has turned. Secondly, Putin has lost Ukraine, as we all know. This is a state-building exercise that we are seeing in Ukraine right now. By pushing Ukraine, Ukraine has pushed back. So there is no, no perspective to get Ukraine back into a Russian sphere of influence in the next 10 or 20 years. That's also why I think a settled agreement is just not going to work. Even, I mean, actually, Western Europeans and probably Americans would like to do that with Russia, but Ukraine stands in their way. You cannot deal with these countries anymore as with objects. They are subjects in their own right, and this is what we learned as well in 2014. So he lost Ukraine. Putin is internationally largely isolated. Russia has been kicked out of the G8, and I don't think that anytime soon Russia will get back. Russia has lost a lot of trust, almost everywhere. Putin has united Europe and revitalized NATO. NATO is now back in the reassurance game. It's looking east. I mean, we had many years in NATO where we had no real discussion about who's the enemy, what are the threats. And now there's a threat. And NATO is reacting. And it's turning around. And it's not because NATO members like that. They hate it. But they have to do something. Putin hasn't won China. And there's no BRIC alliance supporting him. Yes, the BRICS are more or less neutral, but they're not behind Russia at the moment. And then he has undermined his own power base, his economic power base. The sanctions are very much hurting the economy. And this may soon also lead to problems domestically about legitimacy of his rule. So did the West win? Not really. We didn't win either. I think all of us lost. The West has lost, Ukraine has lost, and Russia has lost. Now we are facing a hostile, aggressive Russia. Europe has become more dangerous. The countries in between Russia and the EU are all under threat. Ukraine is at war. People are dying. We don't know how Moldova will look in a year, what will happen in Kazakhstan, other countries. So there is plenty of violence in the air. And China may be the long-time winner. If the multilateral order becomes weaker, it will be much easier for China to push ahead with its own projects in the South China Sea against Japan. If the West is not clearly getting behind the international norms in that case, these norms are getting much weaker, and China may profit one day from it. So I think what Europe needs to do is to defend the multilateral order. This is the order basically enshrined in the UN Charter and in many other international documents. And the EU is, so to speak, has become the paradise of the multilateral order. The main principles of the multilateral order are the guarantee for territorial integrity, sovereignty, the principles of peaceful resolution of conflicts, and international cooperation as much as possible. In the multilateral order, all states have rights regardless of their size. So, for example, in the EU, tiny Malta can always block mighty Germany. So in the EU, power matters as well. But in a rules-based multilateral order, law and institutions are the framework which is organizing and limiting power. So what we are seeing now, I think in 2014, what we have learned is that Russia is fundamentally challenging this order. It's not just about several demands inside that order that could be, satisfied with the tools of this order. No, it is challenging the basics. So, and when we're working with Russia with the tools we're having, diplomatic negotiations, we have Minsk II. Minsk II is a perfect tool for Russia legally to control Ukraine, because it says Ukraine has to negotiate a new constitution with the separatists, with the Kremlin. So the constitution, according to Minsk, would be written in the Kremlin. Law is just an instrument of Russian power in the Russian view, and institutions as well. So how do we deal with that? I think this is the big question that 2014 is leaving to us. And of course, it would be great to bring Russia back in this institutions-based, rules-based world. But we just saw that Russia has left this world. I mean, there was so many efforts led by Germany for 10 years in the first let's say between the early 90s and until Putin returned to the presidency in 2012, I mean, the West did a lot trying to bring Russia into this order. But now we're seeing it's just not interested. So I think, you know, begging the Russians to come back, we can do that, and we are doing that. And it's good to do that. Let's try. But so far it has failed. The big question is, how do we handle this? With power? But what kind of power?
Thank you. Thank you, Uli. Very gloomy picture. All lost except China. We are not going to negotiate new rules. We are rather interested in begging Russia to come back to the rules we have agreed upon after the Cold War. And here we'll come back to the question, what should be first? Should we provide some stability for Ukraine first, and then maybe we'll find a common ground with Russia and negotiate Russia coming back to the norms and rules we see as a fundamental for the order, or otherwise. First, we should force Russia, encourage Russia to come back, and only then we can have a chance to stabilize Ukraine. That's the question we will talk about later. Anton, what about Eurasiatic Union and how crisis of 2014 would contribute to the, the prospects of alternative European Eurasiatic integration?
Thank you, Sławomir. Well, first of all, I got to say it's quite a task to follow up such experts, but I would definitely try to say something fresh. Well, to beginning, I've actually wanted to come back a few questions posed by Mr. Kortunov. Well, there definitely are a few questions that we cannot answer right now at this moment, like how to bring back the global system of governments, how to reform international law, and well, how to peace Middle East and Asia. But definitely there are some questions that we have to answer. And we can answer. And for instance, there is particularly one question I believe we can answer right away. When did this particular crisis that we have in hand today began? I'm sorry. A week ago, on the 27th of February, Kremlin celebrated a new state holiday called Special Operative Day, Special Operative Forces Day. Actually, on the same day, famous and known opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was assassinated. But exactly a year ago, on February 27, 2014, Russian forces have seized key objects in the Crimea Peninsula. A few weeks after that, Crimea announced its independence. On the March 16th, Crimea voted to join Russia, and just in 4 days, from Russian point of view, Crimea became, well, part of the Russian state. When it comes to the east of Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk, sort of so-called People's Republics, there's a brilliant UN General Assembly resolution, 3314, and its Article 3 says, under clause G, explaining, well, clarifying what is an act of aggression, regardless of declaration of war, and which is the sending by or on behalf of a state of armed bands, groups, regulars, or mercenaries which carry out acts of armed forces against another state. So what I'm trying to say here is we just need to, well, name the things by what they are, and what we have now is basically the results of the March referendum and Russia's actions in the east of Ukraine. And in this regard, I do believe the Western sanctions, in the way they were well, the only probably solution that West could have done, considering the Russian nuclear status. But well, coming back to the original topic, to the Eurasian sort of developments. In regard to the so-called Cold War, if we could say that it is, I would agree with my colleagues that it's not yet the time to call this Cold War, but it's definitely a great conflict. And it is quite interesting how the Russian closest allies responded to the whole situation, especially with regards to Ukraine. If you look at Belarus and Kazakhstan, members of the Eurasian Economic Union, and their reaction to the Ukrainian crisis, you would see that none of the leaders, nor Lukashenko nor Nazarbayev, have supported Putin, have recognized Crimea as part of a Russian state, and have not joined Russia in its, well, let's say, anti-sanctions response embargo to the European goods. Moreover, if you look at what Lukashenko and Nazarbayev, how they acted in the last few months, you would see that they have been quite open in voicing their support to the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian people, that they have signaled the West that they are ready to have a dialogue and to cooperate in several issues. And they're generally against the conflict and the role which Russia plays. The Eurasian Union, as it is, was proposed as sort of a counterpart to the EU, a part of a dialogue, a new forum, a new compromise that the West could do in order to, let's say, peace the situation. But if we look inside the Eurasian Economic Union, how it's functioning, and what had actually happened to the union in the last, well, it was announced on the, it was launched January 1st, 2015, but before that, we had a custom union with the same members. You would see that throughout this year there are so many problems, so many shortcomings within the union, with the way it functions, that it is really a big question whether we could consider Eurasian Union as actually a genuine player, and actually a party to any sort of negotiation. The trade between Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan has dropped by at least a third this year. We have witnessed a response by Kremlin to the transfer of goods by Belarus to Kazakhstan, as well, basically temporary closure of one of the cornerstones of the customs union, which was free flow of goods. We have seen that Kazakhstan, in response to the ruble devaluation, has attempted to embargo some of the Russian goods that flow north to through the Kazakhstan border, because they became much cheaper. Moreover, if we go into the institutional aspects of the way Eurasian Union makes its decision, produces its further actions, you see that basically, well, there are only three actors who you should listen to in order to understand how this union will develop, which are the leaders of the states, because the union itself has only a sort of facade institutional structure. But beyond the union itself, the war in Ukraine and the economic struggle that Russia currently faces and lives through has affected the entire region, and this is something we should be prepared for. If you look at Azerbaijan, a state that is not a member of the union and has no close links, like for instance Armenia has to Russia, still suffers quite severely from the economic situation in Russia. You could see that their national currency was recently devaluated by more than a third. If you look to the Central Asian states, you'd see that there's a huge, absolutely huge problem of the exodus of migrant workers from Russia to the Central Asian states. And this is a huge inflow of men of working age that have no jobs, probably don't have a chance to get a job within their states, which are quite poor and stable, and there's a huge factor of radical Islam in those states. Just to drop one of the numbers, if you look at Tajikistan, more than 42% of the financial inflows in the state were actually coming from migrant workers in Russia. And well, if this number grows smaller and smaller by the year, well, this is definitely a challenge to the Tajikistan economy, and this pretty much goes the same for Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. So what we see now is the states that surround Russia, both those who joined the Eurasian Union and did not, they see their relations with Russia rather as liability than an asset, because in the current state of the economy that Russia is in, this is definitely a huge problem. And we do know that Russian policy in the region was one of the mechanisms that Russia conducted as policy in the region was with the question of loans and just well, pretty much used it financial resources. And the further Russia goes into recession, the further it goes into crisis, the less mechanisms it has to affect and to control the political situation in the region itself. I wanted to actually go back to one of the questions asked before regarding the possible compromise with Russia on the whole Ukraine conflict. Just if we could imagine that for some reason West decides that the Ukraine is not really worth the trouble, that the risks are way too high, and well, Kremlin is just way too unpredictable, and Ukraine goes sort of to the Russian sphere of influence. Do we believe that that would be enough for Kremlin just to come down and go on with this life? Because speaking today on the panel, we did not mention a very, very big and important issue that Russia is dealing with now, and this is its economic state. And simply by having Ukraine or retaining some sphere of influence in the region would simply not be enough to go on for Kremlin. So in this regard, the compromise could not be resolved simply on the terms of, well, giving Russia a special sphere of influence and believing that would be enough. And this brings us to the question, what is the end goal for Vladimir Putin in this scenario? Do we actually believe that the end goal is the revision of the post-Cold War order? Do we believe that it's a question of multipolar world? Or is there many aspects to the question, including the very big domestic question, which is that Vladimir Putin, being in power for 15 years, has to maintain himself in power, and the whole Ukrainian conflict, starting with the 16th of March, has played quite well for his approval ratings. And today, simply, he's in the state where, well, there's no going back without a great loss with the domestic approval ratings.
Thank you. So the argument is that the conflict over Ukraine killed Eurasiatic Union as a concept, as an integration project. And the second time in this panel, the idea of the logic of political survival was recalled. Ian was the first one who claimed that it is the main driver of Putin's thinking. Now I would like to start Q&A session, and to do so, as a moderator, I would like to give you one question. And I would like all of you to give me 3 priorities, or where we should start to to seek for the solution, seeking for solution of this crisis. What should be done first? We are, I think, all behind this table. We agree that we are all losing. How we can stop losing? Second, how we could look for the way out. What should be done first? Andrey, would you like to take the question first?
Well, no, Sławomir, the center that you lead has the name of the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding. Frankly, I don't see a lot of dialogue around this table. I think it's a jury which has already made its verdict, and the verdict is guilty. The problem with the jury is that this verdict cannot be enforced. And politics is the art of possible. There are certain things that are possible, and there are things which are not. I can tell you a lot about how the international legal system started to erode long before the Ukrainian crisis. And I can remind you of Yugoslavia and Iraq and Libya and other things. I don't want to say that Russia did not violate the international law, but I think that it would be a kind of oversimplification to say that there is only one villain in the room. I think it will be misguiding. Now, about what can be done and what should be done. In my view, the problem which was not really recognized properly at this table is that we do not have time. We do not have time. We cannot expect a regime change in Moscow anytime soon. We cannot expect the West to accept what has happened in Ukraine. We cannot expect that there'll be a kind of new threat that would brush off the problem that became so clear in 2014. But we're not alone in this race. There is a small country which is called Ukraine. And this country might not necessarily survive this year, the year of 2015. So some compromise on Ukraine, in my view, is almost unavoidable if we are concerned not only about punishing Putin, but also about the Ukrainian statehood. My take, and I agree with Sam, that any decision will be less than perfect. But right now, I think the first thing is to maintain what can be maintained of the Minsk II agreement. And in my view, it would be hypocritical just to say that the Minsk agreement will not work because of this, that, and that. It's not perfect, and it will never work in its full format. But if the Minsk agreement is in a position to stop the bloodshed, this is already a splashing success, in my view. It will not resolve long-term problems of the Ukrainian statehood, but it might stop the military phase of this crisis. So number one, to stop the bloodshed. Number two, to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in the East. And this is not possible without some kind of cooperation between Kyiv and Moscow. Likewise, to prevent Ukraine from a financial and economic implosion, some kind of cooperation between Brussels and Moscow is indispensable in my view. Of course, you can say, Moscow would not accept that. We cannot trust Putin. And that might be right. But I think it's the best shot that we have right now. Because if we fail this year, if 2015 is likely to be a kind of continuation of 2014, I don't know what we are going to discuss here or elsewhere in a year from now. the situation might really run out of the control, and we will have a big black hole in the center of Europe. I do believe in rationality of political leaders. I do believe that all of them can calculate their risks and make decisions on the basis of these calculations. You might say it's wishful thinking, you might say it's pipe dream, but if you assume that there is a madman sitting in the Kremlin with his finger on the nuclear button, then it is pointless to have any discussion, because we cannot analyze interests, we can just talk about the reflexes. So in my view, Ukraine is to be the test. The cards are on the table. Both sides know that they are not likely to win this conflict militarily. Both sides have their limitations on how much they can yield on this issue. So I think that we should give this process at least a chance, because I don't know what will happen if we all fail.
Uli, you are next.
Yeah, compromise on Ukraine, we have one. I mean, but the question is Russia satisfied with having this chunk of territory in the east and Crimea? Or isn't it about control of Ukraine? And then we have another game. It's about sovereignty. I mean, sovereignty is the key feature of any state in the international system. And as we see, Ukraine is not ready to compromise on its sovereignty. Of course, it doesn't mean to enter NATO anytime soon. It doesn't, maybe we have even delayed the DCFTA for 1 year because of some people wanted that. And so there is plenty of compromise. Minsk II is very favorable to Russia. It has a legal mechanism for Russia to be the author of the future Ukrainian constitution. So, I mean, it's really everything Putin could wish for. But the question is not so much where do we go with Minsk. The question is, on the military side, will Russia continue to escalate? Will Mariupol be next? How about Odessa? And this is sorry, I mean, there's not only one villain, but we're just seeing a military aggression in 2014 in Europe, which is undermining the European peace order. And I'm sorry, this hasn't been started by Ukraine, not started by Poland, and not started by Germany or the US. So there is a problem. Priorities, I think number one is stabilize Ukraine. And the West needs to do much, much more, sending in more technical assistance, more people, really connect Ukraine with the West, which has not been done for 20 years. I think in hindsight, this was the biggest failure. It was not, we engaged with Russia all the time. And Ukraine was a footnote. And the stream of people and ideas and everything went to Moscow and nothing went to Kiev. And this made Ukraine weak. And Ukrainian weakness is the main problem. The problem is the weakness of the post-Soviet countries, which don't have real borders. If Ukraine would have a border, or had a border, and 1 year ago, it wouldn't have been possible for troops to enter territory and weapons. So stabilizing Ukraine, providing Russia with real borders, delimiting the territory, turning an empire or an imperial structure into a nation state, this remains the challenge. That's why I think we need much more engage with post-Soviet countries, Belarus, Armenia. They play the geopolitical game. Europe should also play the geopolitical game. The third point, I'm in favor of stationing troops, permanent NATO troops. I think the reassurance is okay, but it's not great. It leaves some holes, it leaves some doubts, which shouldn't be there. Thank you.
Thank you. Marek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm hesitant to speak on that matter because obviously I will be accused for warmongering. As a Russophile, as a person who truly, I mean, I'm not joking, which truly admires the Russian people who have survived enormous sufferings in the last century. I wish Russia all the best. I wish Russia prosperity. I wish Russia being a modern, democratic, prosperous state. But the problem is that Russia, well, we use the term Russia, which in fact means maybe a dozen of people who making decisions. And in some cases it could be even much less than a dozen, maybe just one person who is making decisions, and which creating enormous problems, not only for us here in this part of the world, not only for Ukraine and Russia's neighborhood, but first of all, and the most, for the Russian people themselves. And that's a sad truth. So I very much hesitant to say and to advocate for tough measures, for tough policies, not because I am against the Russian people, against Russia as a state, but I do believe that there cannot be any ways to influence the current policies of the current Russia's leadership otherwise than to persuade to this leadership that their policies are not working, are not effective, are not leading to the goals which they themselves decided to set before Russia. That's the logic, I believe. President Putin has to be convinced that his policy does not deliver these goals which he and some of his conservative colleagues defined as the interest of Russia. So my response to that lies within the three areas. One is to keep the pressure on Russia with sanctions and to communicate to the Russian leadership what will be the next stages of sanctions, on what contingencies they will be executed almost automatically. Secondly, I believe that it should be reinforced by much more active information policy, also towards Russia itself. So Russian-speaking media towards Russia, covering Russia, and actively counteracting a massive propaganda which makes a terrible brainwashing of the Russian people now. Secondly, second stage, is the support for Ukraine to sustain as a country in a situation of war, which may include, in my perception, also deliveries of weapons, unfortunately, to higher the stakes for the use of Russian armed forces directly in Ukraine, unfortunately. And also to keep the pressure for the Ukrainian government with financial help, with advisory help, but also in a sense of pressure to do the necessary reforms. Because without those reforms, the future of Ukraine as an independent state and as a democratic state will be under question. So it is in Ukraine's good interests to have a conditional support, not unconditional support from the West. And thirdly, we have to deal with ourselves. much more effectively. We have to stop unilateral disarmament in Europe. We have to take care about our own defense, not constantly looking at the US as our savior who should fix everything, all the problems. For us, it's our security, and we have to deal with this ourselves. We should create a credible deterrence towards Russia, rising again the stakes by the deployments, by the substantial deployments on NATO eastern flank. For those who sees that as unnecessary provocation, I would respond that there is nothing more provocative for Russia than the policy of not provoking Russia. Because this is kind of invitation. Let's test the West further. Let's move further. Let's test how they react and what we can do. So that's the kind of a drawing. The red line would be stabilizing effect, in my sense. Stabilizing effect rather than destabilizing effect, paradoxically. And also, I believe we have to deal with the Russia's corruption schemes within Europe. These are powerful network of Russian corruption schemes within the countries of Europe. And this is a kind of a very, I'm just finishing, this is a very weak point of the Russian leadership, which despite of its whole patriotic slogans, is deeply cynical and corrupt. So touching their personal economic security and safety is, in my perception, also the way of dealing with them. And Putin is not madman. Putin does not lead Russia to a third world war. So we should not succumb to this fear culture that Russia tries to impose on us, that whatever we will do as small things to defend ourselves will be provoking potentially a third world war. That's rubbish. That's a bluff. And that's actively used as a psychological warfare. Thank you.
Thank you. I like the point that we should start from ourselves. Anton.
I have to agree with Professor Kortunov on saying that the main goal now for the short term is to stop the bloodshed. And the recipe is quite simple. For the perfect world, obviously, is to withdraw forces for Russia, to withdraw volunteers from the east of Ukraine, and to return the border under Ukrainian control. But in the real world, the recipe is to implement international peacekeeping forces into the region. After that, for Europe and the US truly commit to Ukraine by proposing an extensive Marshall Plan for the Ukrainian economy, help in the extensive economic reforms and institutional reforms as well. And third thing, which you will not like, is EU entry date set sometime in the future. Thank you.
It's the real world?
Well,
It's the real world you said?
Yep.
Oh, so I live in a different world then.
Okay, Ian, that's your turn.
Thank you very much. I'll try and keep it fairly short. My three priorities. The first is defense and deterrence. And Marek is absolutely right. We have neglected this for far too long. But it's not just a question of spending our 2%. And, you know, Poland can be proud of its record on that. Britain, I'm afraid, is about to lose its place on that. Deterrence depends not just on capability, but also on will and the demonstration of will. Now, at the moment, what we have is unilateral deterrence. And this is where the question of Putin as the madman in the Kremlin with his finger on the button is so effective. Now, in the Cold War, we had mutually assured destruction. sounds terribly immoral, but actually it worked extremely well as a stabilizing mechanism. When NATO carried out its big tabletop, or not tabletop, but command post exercise with, which ended in a nuclear phase, Mrs. Thatcher, as Prime Minister, made a point of taking over from her officials to conduct the nuclear phase of the exercise. And that was well known, so that nobody could be in any doubt that if a conflict broke out, Margaret Thatcher was ready. That is stabilizing, provided that both sides know that that is the case. Now, we know that Vladimir Putin thinks like that, otherwise there would be no point in sending Bear bombers with cruise missiles loaded up and down the English Channel and around Ireland. He is telling us, I am not afraid to trigger the Third World War, and we're saying, my God, he's not afraid to trigger the Third World War, we must make some more concessions. Actually, the answer to that is, okay, we're not either. Because I do think that he is a rational actor, and rational actors in those circumstances will look for ways to de-escalate. But at the moment, we have a situation in which whatever, I mean, it's Lenin's bayonet. You know, if you push the bayonet in and you meet mush, keep pushing. If you hit something hard, stop pushing. Well, Putin has pushed his bayonet through an awful lot of Western leaders, and he has yet to hit anything hard. So that's defense and deterrence. The second is law. Marek is absolutely right. Corruption is a terrible scandal, but it's a terrible scandal on both sides. If there are Russians in this room who want to be angry with Britain, please don't be angry over fictional British intelligence causing trouble in Ukraine. They weren't there and they weren't causing trouble. If you want to be angry that the City of London helps to facilitate the theft of hundreds of billions of dollars from the Russian people. Russia's economy would not be in the terrible state that it's in now if so much of the money that was earned in Russia stayed in Russia instead of being laundered through Cyprus and Latvia and Austria and the British Virgin Islands and London. That's my second point.
May I ask something here? Wouldn't they just go somewhere else if we would close these loopholes?
If they want to put their money into Nauru and expect ever to see it again, they're welcome to try. I mean, the reason that it works is because we have rule of law, and if you put your money into a bank, you expect that you will be able to get it out again. Sometimes it doesn't work, but you know, more often than not it does. Even in the depths of the financial crisis, it worked. But the last thing that I would say is that we need more contact. Now, I hear what Andrey says, that, you know, this is not a dialogue, it's the jury. I don't suppose these dialogues are ever very comfortable. But we had a lot of dialogues in the Cold War. We didn't agree with each other. But the point is that at least by continuing to talk, you do get some sense of what is going on the other side and why they may see the world in the way that they do. We've lost a lot of those channels, or we're not using them as effectively as we used to. I will take my hat off to Angela Merkel, who I think in the course of the last year spoke more than 30 times to Vladimir Putin, but practically nobody else made the effort. I mean, she spoke to Putin more than twice as many times as Obama did, and I think about 4 times as many times as David Cameron or François Hollande did. So we need to talk, even if we're not agreeing. And we also need to build the people-to-people contacts, even if we don't agree. Better, I mean, I look back 30 years when I was learning Russian, sitting in a student common room in England, arguing with somebody who was on a Soviet exchange program about what had happened at the end of the Second World War, you know, what had happened, why Europe was the shape that it was. We didn't agree, but at least I came away from that with more understanding of why he might look at the map of Europe in a different way from me. And I think, again, I fear that we have lost some of that. I hope that I will never again see Russian television cutting pictures of Russian soldiers on a nuclear launch exercise with a simulation of what London would look like if a nuclear warhead detonated over it. That would be a good place to start improving the dialogue.
Sam.
Thanks. I won't get into some of the specifics about near-term objectives, in part because a lot of things have been mentioned, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. But what I would say, something that we should do or should not do, is we should not give in to nostalgia for the Cold War. Despite what has been said on this panel, the Cold War was not a period of stability and clear-eyed strategy. The fact that it ended without a nuclear exchange was as much a function of luck as it was of policy. You know, I could mention another NATO nuclear exercise that came to the brink, that brought us all to the brink of nuclear Armageddon in 1983. That was only 30 years ago. So I just think, and that was not the only near miss. We should keep that in mind. And the second thing, you know, there was a degree of stability in Europe in the Cold War, perhaps, although I would remind our audience about several Soviet invasions in various countries in Eastern Europe over the course of the Cold War. But there were proxy wars and instability across the entire rest of the world. Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa. If you look at statistically, in the 15 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, more conflicts ended than in the 50 preceding it. So avoiding Cold War nostalgia would be one of the things I would recommend that we would do. The second is to be honest with ourselves about the question and the principle of freedom of choice. It's a great principle, and I think in an ideal world, it would be great if every country could have every choice that it wanted granted. However, the most damaging thing you can do to a principle is to deprive it of any meaning. And when you have on the one hand people saying there's no realistic prospect of granting Ukraine its stated choice of membership in Euro-Atlantic institutions anytime soon, and on the other hand saying we must preserve the principle of freedom to choose, I'm left a bit confused. And the second point is that in the name of granting Ukraine its choices, we cannot deprive ourselves of our own choices. Western governments, the Polish government, the US government, have choices too. And they have been, you know, involved in the choices that led to something like the options that Ukraine has now available to it. So in the name of granting Ukraine its own choices, we shouldn't be depriving ourselves of them.
Okay. Now I'd like to open the floor for the questions, and there are two rules. First rule is that you have to introduce yourself at the beginning. Second, you have to be as brief as only possible. Okay, here we have first gentleman asking for floor. Second, I will collect 3 questions and go back to the panel.
Andrzej Kopczynski, I have one question. Whether Putin is predictable and taken into account Tak. Myślę, że to było bardzo zwięzłe pytanie.
Ale nie, moment.
No, hold on a second. I want to make a point here.
Explanations. Why do you think this question may be important? There are experts behind this table, so they know how to. Okay, is Putin predictable? Yeah.
I drugie pytanie.
And the second question, who really rules in Russia?
Jacek Ciotski. Bartosz, I'm sorry. Too many Ciotskis in this town.
Cichocki, anyway. Cichocki, and my question probably goes to Professor Kortunov. Last year, during his annual press conference, President Putin was asked about the ways out of the economic disaster Russia is facing, and his answer was the crisis will end up in 2 years. My question is, what makes him such an optimist? And second part...
No.
Okay, I tried at least.
One question.
Very brief.
Yes.
How long Russia will stand the sanctions, taking into account that the capital is shrinking? Did you get it? How long Russia will stand the sanctions, even tougher? Because you haven't taken this question. I'm just a bit surprised.
Okay.
Okay.
I forget to introduce myself.
Yes.
Sławomir, colleague in city.
Okay. So let's start from the right side this time.
Is Vladimir Putin predictable? Well, to some extent, yes and no. Did we expect a year ago that the situation would evolve as it did today? Or did we expect 6 months ago, when it was quite obvious that sanctions hit Russia, for Putin to go further and escalate further in the east of Ukraine? Well, I believe no. Could we predict today, upon the experience we've had for the last year and maybe the last 15 years, that he will not stop just because, well, the economy is going further down? Probably yes. So the question is, to which logic Vladimir Putin responds, and that's a tricky one. This is something that could not be simply understood, and probably because Russia is not a simple state or a similar state to what we have here, what you have here in Europe. In terms of 2 years, at that time, when Vladimir Putin said that there are only 2 years that we need to wait, there was a lot of information by various experts in oil markets that in 2 years oil is going to go up. This could be option number one. Option number two is that you have to have a date. And 2 years, well, it's quite long, but it's not long enough. And 2 years, there's new elections, and there's a lot of mystery with 2 years from when Putin well, said what he said in the conference. And the third question was...
how long?
How long? Well, once again, if you look at the financial reserves that Russia have, majority of the Russian economic experts agree that there's something about 2 to 3 years that Russia could sustain using those funds, taking that oil prices would now go down even further. Although we must well, take into consideration that just a few days ago it was decided to spend up to 90% of one of the reserve funds, which is quite decent enough of rubles to spend, and this situation might change. But
just one brief comment to the question: is Putin predictable? I think we need to get out of this reactive mood and wait for the next move. What we need to do is to narrow his options. He's testing us. Let's start to test him. Let's close options. I mean, we see this on the military side, Balkans, Greece, Hungary, right-wing parties. He's just, you know, as you said, Ian, cutting through our... and looking where the resistance is, and so yeah, we need to narrow his options, and then we stop asking what will be his next move. We need to make moves. I think we're doing okay, but we still need to. I mean, there's still this view that this crisis will go away, and then we can move back to the status quo ante. We need really to start more long-term planning in scenarios and prepare more and get back our agency, act and not just react.
I think that's an excellent point. I think I'll just pick up the sanctions question. Russia can survive the current sanctions pretty much indefinitely. It's not the sanctions that are driving the Russian economy into a ditch. It is the fact that it is so grossly dependent on hydrocarbons. So if the oil price recovers, Russia will be fine. If the oil price stays low, Russia will not be fine. It's the lack of reform, the negative investment climate and everything that goes with it, and a particularly acute case of the Dutch disease, where in effect the hydrocarbons sector has killed off much of the rest of the productive capacity of Russia, that's doing it the damage. So the longer the oil price stays low, the less likely it is that Russia is going to get through this crisis unscathed.
Marek, that's your turn.
Thank you. This one? Yes, right. Trying to be short. I think, first of all, Putin is a rational actor, absolutely rational actor. Simply he has different criteria for rationality than we do have. He is prone to sometimes very risky decisions, but all these decisions are well calculated. So they are based on certain assessment of the situation, and this assessment differs with our own assessment of the situation, and that's I think it's important to understand. Therefore, because we differ in those assessments, and because Russian policy tactics is extremely flexible, with the kind of strategic goals which are permanent, but the tactics being very flexible, it's very difficult to predict the next moves, because simply because of that, because of different perception, different assessment, and the flexibility in tactics. So in that sense, Putin is difficult to predict. But I don't know whether it's properly fits to the definition of unpredictable. How long Russia will stand the sanctions? I fully agree with what Ian has said about the limited influence of sanctions on the Russian economy. The most important sanctions are the Russian sanctions against the counter-sanctions against the West, which influences prices, first of all, higher inflation mostly due to that. The one most important single short-term factor which influences obviously oil prices, and Russia is already burning its reserves. For the last 14 months, Russian currency reserves has shrinked 28%, and there are more proposal of the government, from the government, to spend about $50 to $60 billion of reserves for example, subsidizing and helping banks, which some of them are a real difficult situation. But depending on the oil, it can be carried on for several years still. Of course, we never know how deep the crisis could be. But in fact, the basic reason of the trouble is the systemic inefficiency of the Russian economic system. And this is the kind of systemic sources. We have already seen through the indicators that the Russian economy growth has decoupled from the high oil prices. And it was clear before the current crisis.
Sam?
This question about how long Russia can withstand sanctions, presumably the assumption is that withstand until it changes enough to cause the sanctions to be lifted. I think makes me wonder when we all became such Marxist. The economic determinism that is sort of at the basis of that, or an assumption built into that, not only question but the policy, flies in the face of a lot of irrational, non-economic determinist behavior that you see in international politics. Forget about Russia for a second. North Korea, Cuba, Iran, countries that have been under far more draconian sanctions regimes for far longer periods don't implode, capitulate. I mean, perhaps sometimes they do, but those are cases where they didn't, right? So I just think we have to be realistic about what economic sanctions can accomplish. Now, that having been said, it does seem like a 2 to 3 year period is a reasonable expectation for how long Russia can keep going without dramatically transforming its economy in a far more autarkic way. So in maintaining more or less the current economic model might be a 2 to 3 year period, but that doesn't mean that after that 2 to 3 year period you'll either see collapse or capitulation. You might just see the economy transforming to adapt.
Andrey.
I'm still on your list. People here know much more about Russia than I do, I assume. But let me say, first of all, on predictability. I think that the advantage, one of the advantages of Mr. Putin is that he is definitely a brilliant tactician. And he has a sense of what he needs to maintain what he defines as political stability, but if you wish, that can be called to maintain his personal power. And if you put the Ukraine crisis in this perspective, definitely he realized at some point that the old source of legitimacy was eroding and something had to be done to restore it on a different basis, and he became legitimate as president of a country at war. And if you judge him from this viewpoint, it's an absolutely rational behavior because the level of political and social consolidation of Russia today is unprecedented. Whether it stays that way, we don't know. But so far, domestically speaking, Putin has been not only rational, he has been victorious. Second, on the crisis and on oil prices. Let me express my viewpoint. I think that there are 3 challenges that Russia faces and which it will have to deal with within the next couple of years. First of all, we have very weak institutions. And when at the Valdai meeting, first deputy head of the presidential administration says that today Putin is Russia and Russia is Putin, unfortunately it's not that much of an exaggeration. You take Putin out and the whole political system crumbles, because we don't have a strong government, a strong parliament, we don't have strong political parties either. Second, it's exactly about the economy of the country. We do not have an alternative model of the economic development. And that's why most those who are in power think about oil prices, because it's a natural way out. Let's wait. Prices will go up sooner or later, and we will be fine again. It's not because they necessarily know that prices will go up, but because there is no alternative model that can be convincing enough for the public to accept it. And finally, of course, I think it's important, the next challenge is really to restore, if not favorable, at least neutral external environment, which will be a tremendous task, whoever is in charge in Moscow. And finally, on sanctions. I don't want to disappoint you, but if you look at the impact of sanctions today, I think that the most affected by sanctions are exactly the most pro-Western and liberal factions in the Russian society. Because if you take financial sanctions, Gazprom and Rosneft will get their money anyway. But small and medium-sized enterprises will go bankrupt. If you look at the technology sanctions, again, these will affect mostly innovative companies, which happen to be small-sized companies. So I don't know what will happen tomorrow, but today, if the intention was to hit people close to Putin, I don't think that it really works that well. On the contrary, I think sanctions contribute to this consolidation of a large part, not all, but a large part of the Russian society around Mr. Putin and his political regime.
Excellent. So we have time for 3 more questions. Anton.
I was here. Yeah, I was here at the first panel. So the Poles, together with Russians, they proved to be real experts on Russia, and that is why I want Marek to elaborate more on what he said on Russian corruption policy in Europe. Do you mean, let us say, specific policy to specific countries as Hungary, Greece, or whatsoever, or you mean simply lobbying of Russian interests?
Yeah.
Thank you. Jerzy Nowak, former ambassador to OSCE and NATO. Debate was fascinating on the question of diagnosis, but was much weaker on Lenin's question, what is to be done? And I referred to that, and that my question is directed to Professor Kortunov. Did I interpret you well, Professor, that you said in your second intervention, more or less this following way: let's put aside Crimea, let's put aside this what happened in Donbass and Lugansk, and let's now sit down and discuss, probably with European Union only, the future of Ukraine. I know I'm doing this in simplified way, but it seems that this was the tendency. If it is so, it seems to me that that is not a starter point. Thank you.
My short question goes probably to some, because you mentioned, as I remember, a sort of give and take approach that we should somehow think about. So my question goes like this, so that we didn't fly in high in the skies, what and who shall give, what should be given by whom and when? I mean, in detailed way. I mean, because that sort of transactional approach makes me think that Russia also has something to offer, and that's what I'm interested especially in. I mean, because I know what Russia expects from the other side. I'm wondering what Russia can offer to us.
I can accept one question to all panelists if it's not. So let's start from Marek. The question about yeah.
Always confused. Thanks. Thank you. To Artyom's questions, a difficult one, because it would involve, of course, the finger pointing to the weakest part. But Ian already relieved me to mention city. But obviously, what I meant was not to tackle with legal Russian investment in any countries of European Union, or even hopefully legally acquired private property in the EU member states. But I would rather tackle those issues who are formally forbidden also in Russia. So now we have an anti-corruption campaign in Russia, we have a campaign on so-called nationalization of the elite, we have a campaign against so-called de-offshorization, but of course we have also some half-hearted attempts to limit, for example, huge properties of the salarymen, I mean high officials in the EU countries, which are official Russian policy, but which I would say is rather half-hearted until now, at least if they reach some level, upper level. And we should help, in a way, Russia in that. Simply, we should help by revealing this money, by revealing the persons, yes, we would like to help the President Putin's declared policy on crack on corruption in Russia. So any kind of money laundering, for example, there are institutions which should be strengthened in Europe and internationally. There are some institutions who are dealing with that, both in the US, also in the European Union, we know that. We should help those institutions, we should strengthen them. We should, for example, change our EU legislation on that, because there are some attempts to change EU legislation to make, for example, certain more opening necessity for provide the information about the source of the capital coming, and so on and so on. So these are all decent legal measures which I believe we should actively pursue, helping the Russian government to tackle this problem in all countries, whether it is Cyprus, whether it is Latvia, whether it is Austria, Germany, any other, Poland, I don't know, maybe if there is so, any other country which may have some problems with that. Thank you.
Andrey?
Well, you know, on the issue of East Ukraine, Crimea, and cooperation, first of all, I don't want to imply that we should forget about these issues. Definitely, if the Ukrainian side takes it that the Crimean problem and the Western side does exist, Russia cannot ignore it. My only point is that if we start our discussions with the Crimean issue, the odds are that we will end with the Crimean issue, and we will not move any further. I believe that it is a long-term problem which will not go away, which will definitely poison the relations between Russia and the West, between Russia and Ukraine, and it might be resolved only in the general framework of the multilateral relations in Europe. But I assume, and I might be dead wrong on that, but I assume that given the current status of the Ukrainian economy, the only way to maintain and to consolidate the Ukrainian statehood would be to support it from the West and from the East. If Russia is not engaged in this process, moreover, if Russia actively opposes this process, it would be very difficult, if possible at all, to turn the Ukrainian project into success. Now, the question is, you know, we know the fundamentals, we know people who are making policy decisions in the Kremlin. The question is how to prove to these people that it is their interest to participate in a multilateral project that would consolidate the Ukrainian statehood. How to make sure that it is not in their interest to see Ukraine imploding. And I believe that in order to achieve this goal, you need to use both sticks and carrots. I can more or less understand what kind of sticks you have, though I find it difficult to have a direct causal line between the US or European arms and the Ukrainian statehood, but we can put it aside. I don't see too many of carrots that would allow Putin to embark on this way if he ultimately decides to do that. Again, you know, it will not be perfect, and of course, many would accuse the West of appeasement. I think that there'll be a lot of criticism, but in my view, the problem is so compelling, and the challenge is so huge for the European continent that this problem in itself deserves some kind of a compromise. As far as the United States is concerned, definitely the United States can and should play a role here, but the interests of the European Union in resolving this crisis, in my view, are much greater than that of the United States.
Well, I should say that there are different views on what the interests of the United States are in the United States. So I won't go there. I was asked a specific question about what should be given by whom and when. It's a good question, but it's kind of a trick question because you don't know until you begin talking or having a negotiation what exactly the final agreement is going to be. I mean, so for me to sit here and speculate on the details of the outcome of a process that hasn't even begun would be, I think, setting myself up to be criticized without any concrete basis in reality, because the fact is the process hasn't even begun. And on that note, you know, talking is not the same as agreeing. And so there's always an option for any party to a negotiation to walk away if they can't find agreement. Just want to put that on the table. But we won't know the answer to your question until we start talking. What can Russia offer? There was sort of a second follow-up or a related question. I mean, I don't think Ukrainians, Moldovans, Georgians would have a hard time answering that question. And I think, you know, in there lies the answer. That this, you know, to put it bluntly, an end to what we've been seeing over the last year is, frankly, a lot in this context, particularly for Ukrainians.
Jan?
Well, there isn't a huge amount that I can add. I mean, I think the problem that I have with Sam's sort of process for some kind of new dispensation. Let me start it from a different point. Sam accused some of us, at least, of Marxist economic determinism. Actually, I'm thinking about a different Marx. I'm thinking about the Marx brothers. And there's a scene in one of their films where somebody arrives with a very long contract. And the person who is supposed to sign the contract progressively goes down the contract saying, I don't like the first part, I don't like the second part, and the lawyer keeps tearing off more and more of the contract until there's basically nothing left. And that's sort of where I fear that we have ended up. I can go through the 10 principles of the Helsinki Final Act and find that there isn't much left. And I don't quite know where I start crafting a new dispensation after that.
I'd like to go back to the question of Ukraine. I mean, it's obvious that Ukraine needs Russia and they are economically interdependent. However, I have a hard time to imagine Russia as a beneficial actor at the moment in Ukraine. I mean, the structures that are in place in Ukraine have also been supported from Russia. Russia didn't do anything to build rule of law institutions. This is state building is what Ukraine needs, not just more oligarchs, corrupt structures. So this is something that only the EU can help with, or the US to a certain extent. So I think there will be necessarily a time where there is a kind of divorce between Russia and Ukraine. Because Ukraine needs space for state building.
I sort of wanted to finish on the positive note, and actually I wanted to continue something that Professor Kortunov has said regarding that the West should not only punish Putin, but do something else. And this something else could be the vision that the transatlantic community has for Russia, so that Russia would know where EU and US stands. Just simply portraying how in the future Russia and what role Russia would play. So this could be something to begin the actual dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to say at the end the following thing. There are not inflation of places where you can have dialogue this time between Russia and the outside world. That's the first point I wanted to make. So in the center, which is a center for dialogue and understanding, not necessarily compromise and understanding, it is one of the unique places we can have it. Dialogue is, as you can see, very difficult. But it is not about, it is not caused by neither by the institution, nor by the people, but we are living in very difficult times, which makes dialogue and the communication very difficult. There is no dialogue without people, however. No matter how many institutions we can create, there are people who matters. So, having said that, I would like all of you sitting here in this room to thank all participants of this panel and the conference, because there are people who are willing and able to communicate to each other, not necessarily agree with each other, as we can had a chance to see, but at least to exchange views and show determined that they are willing to continue, despite all these difficult times around us. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to all members of this panel and the participants of the conference. Applause.